In this lecture, I'd like to focus first on the pilgrim's experience within the heaven of the sun, which Dante devotes an unusually large space to. And then in the second half of this lecture, I'll turn to talking about an overarching theme for all of these canti, Paradiso 10 to 20, the relationship between plurality and unity. Let's begin with the heaven of the sun. The heaven of the sun is often a favorite passage for students reading the Paradiso, in part because most of us recognize all three of the speakers within, as well as the people they're discussing. To the speeches of Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure, Dante devotes 4 whole canti. In Canto 10, we meet Thomas Aquinas, who introduces us to some of the other souls in this heaven, as if he were a curator showing us the most precious treasures in his museum. Here's my beloved teacher, Albert the Great. There's Gratian, the church's best canon lawyer, who helped the church think practically about the daily issues it had to deal with. The most beautiful soul over there is Solomon. And then there's Dionysius the Areopagite, who my listeners will remember I referred to in the first Paradiso lecture on the ineffability of God. There's also Isidore and Bede, the great encyclopedist of the Middle Ages, and then Richard of St. Victor, a master of the interior life, called by Dante, and contemplation more than human. And finally, there's also Boethius. Aquinas is clearly proud of this set of souls who adorn the heaven of the sun, and of them the narrator says, quote, "In the court of heaven from which I have returned, there are many precious gems of such worth and beauty that they may not be taken from the realm." End quote. But in addition to being called gems, they're also referred to appropriately as many flashing lights of blinding brightness and as blazing suns. In Canto 11, Thomas Aquinas continues. Here the great Dominican scholar poetically tells the life of St. Francis, obviously the founder of the Franciscan order. In Canto 12, Bonaventure, the Franciscan, begins speaking, first relating the life of Dominic, the founder of the Dominican order, before he too turns to naming another group of souls in this circle, Hugh of St. Victor, early followers of Francis, Nathan the prophet, Chrysostom, the great preacher, and the Cistercian preacher, Joachim of Calabria. And finally, in Paradiso 13, Thomas takes back over again, talking about how the grace of God worked through nature to bring wisdom into the world. It's interesting that throughout these canti, then, Dante goes out of his way to make them not just poetic, but densely poetic. Metaphors stack up, and poetic patterns tie the speeches together. For instance, when Aquinas is describing Francis, the holy man of God, he cycles through a whole carousel of images. He likens Francis to a sun that rose on the world. He then describes Francis as one of those passionate lovers from a rich family who disobeys daddy's wishes and marries the poor girl for love. He says that Francis went on missionary work, but that the Muslims were unripe for conversion, using a garden metaphor. He refers to Peter's ship upon the sea, likening Francis to a navigator. And finally, he refers to the wayward flock of Francis, effectively likening him to a shepherd. At the same time, Aquinas engages in some poetic wordplay. Quote, "Therefore let anyone who would speak of this place not say Ashesi, which would come up short, but call it Orient to sound its proper worth." In other words, we should think of Assisi as the little town in which the world was remade, the place in which the world was recreated with a new sun. Thus, let's not call it Assisi, which is close to the Latin ascesi, meaning to ascend, but rather let's call it the Orient, the place where the sun is reborn on a daily basis. And so Aquinas, that theologian of the serious par excellence here in heaven, starts using puns and getting playful. Aquinas in heaven has grown uncharacteristically wordy and surprisingly poetic. In fact, in Canto 11, on 2 occasions, Aquinas has to stop himself, recognizing that his poetic exuberance has grown so warm that the pilgrim might not be able to understand. In verse 73, he says, "But lest I make my meaning dark," and then again in verse 133, "And so if my words are not dark." But if we zoom out just a bit, we also realize that the densely poetic texture of these canti is found not only in the highly metaphorical and playful language of the speakers, but also in the chiasmic ordering of the speeches themselves, That is, the speeches and speakers are delicately woven together in an X-like pattern. Thomas first speaks about the companions and then tells the story of Francis. Bonaventure tells the story of Dominic and then introduces his companions. The two, poetically, look at one another in the mirror and see their right side reflected as their left, and vice versa. It's important to recognize that the historical reality behind this poetic masterpiece, that these two orders, although they had a lot in common, were also rivals in the Middle Ages. Both Franciscans and Dominicans taught in the famous universities of the day, but they emphasized different core principles. The Dominicans, thanks to their roots in fighting dualistic heresies, were keen to emphasize how grace works through nature. They emphasized the power of reason and the importance of study. They said that without knowledge, you can't love, and that first the bow is bent in study. That is, knowing makes you more likely to love. Franciscans were good scholars too, but due to their roots in Francis's radical embrace of poverty, they tended to emphasize the importance of the will in the spiritual life, the power to choose. They wanted to protect the unknowability of God and preserve his frightening distance. And so to simplify things, if Dominicans proceeded to love through knowledge, Franciscans got there through willful acts of service and discipline. It so happens among human beings that even when they agree on almost everything, that if there's not even a difference in opinion, but rather just a difference in emphasis, there can, and in fact almost always sadly is, a falling out. In the Middle Ages, we know many Franciscan authors, for example, who wrote against Aquinas, and some Franciscan leaders even forbade their followers to even read his writings. With these tensions in mind, then, we can turn back to the text of Dante to see how he poetically hints at those differences in these canti. Remember, Francis was described as a lover, a man of poverty, and a shepherd. But Dominic, the great heresy buster, is described in terms entirely different. Dominic's not a wide-eyed lover, but, quote, the holy athlete, like a broken-nosed fighter from Philadelphia. Dominic, Dante says, was born behind, quote, the shelter of the noble shield, and is, quote, gentle to his own and savage to his foes. And for savage, Dante uses the word raw, crudo. Dominic's marriage to the church is described in terms of courtly love, as if he were a knight in waiting. Dominic is described as the wheel of a chariot which smashes down the faces of enemies in battle. Then finally, he's described as a kind of storm which strikes with hurricane-like force. And yet, at the same time, Dante also says that Dominic's work gives rise to fruit. Dante refers to him as one who travels through the vineyard and is, quote, preserving the seed of the 24 plants now wreathing around you in light. His followers are a garden in which the weeds are overgrown, and Dominic is described as a spring which watered them when he was alive. Do you see what Dante has done? Through his careful crafting of the metaphors, he's both brought these saints together and kept them apart. Francis, the wild-eyed lover, is contrasted to Dominic, the Rocky Balboa warrior athlete saint. And yet both are nourishers of flocks, both are gardeners, both are sun-like. Both make sure, to quote Dante, that their saplings grow with greater vigor. Both souls now shine like the sun, shield themselves in brilliance, because they poured out the radiance of their love on earth. And so, the two groups which viewed one another with suspicion, now have the delightful opportunity to recognize that they were actually playing for the same team. And so we find that almost as if in recompense for their earthly doubts of one another, every time they hear praise of the other order, they are overcome with joyful recognition. Hey, that's what I aim to do in life. Note that as soon as Aquinas has finished speaking, Bonaventure is moved to return the favor. He says, "It's fitting that in naming one we name the other, so that just as they were joined as one in combat with a single goal, their fame should shine as one." And again, in keeping with the densely poetic structure of these canti, Dante goes out of his way to describe how these souls become interwoven with one another. For instance, at the end of Canto 10, the souls are likened to the parts of a clock. Needless to say, In a clock, if gears and mechanisms are moving in opposite directions, that doesn't mean the clock's broken or at odds with itself. On the contrary, in a clock, divergent movement is necessary for a unified function. But there are more metaphors and similes used. At the beginning of Canto 12, after Thomas has finished his speech, the souls cannot help but to break into dance and song again. They're likened to a turning millstone, then to an orchestra, to a wreath of flowers woven together, and even to twin rainbows. At the end of Bonaventure's story of Dominic, all the souls are moved yet again. And Dante describes them as when you look up at the nighttime sky and see a bunch of stars shining. But then you recognize that those stars, which you had admired as a collection of individuals, actually forms a constellation. But then you zoom out one more time and recognize that even that constellation is the centerpiece of an even bigger constellation. And so we have example after example of interweaving of individuals, including some individuals who no one, neither Dominican nor Franciscan, would ever have thought would have made it. For instance, Aquinas mentions Siger of Brabant, a shocking move by the poet Dante, because Siger was Aquinas' arch-enemy in life. They each wrote numerous books to refute one another. And so we have a vision of the heaven of the sun, which would be a little bit like if Notre Dame and Ave Maria University decided to start accepting one another's credits and sharing faculty. Or perhaps if you went to heaven and found Jose Maria Escrivá, Pius XII, Dorothy Day, and Thomas Merton all holding hands. Dante's poetry stacks up and weaves together a cornucopia of metaphors to show how God weaves together different kinds of people within the history of the Church. But we can keep probing, because the veins of these rich canti go even deeper. We can ask, what is the secret link between these two groups of souls? What secret unity do they possess, which each group was tempted to overlook in life? Well, both saints are said to have gone before the Pope to get his permission for their orders. Both men are described as master strategizers, builders of men and plans, directors of projects. Dominic got to this end through study, by teaching what he had contemplated. Francis got there through the practice of poverty. And so in this way, both men were dedicated to the same basic Christian truths, but they built their lives, orders, and projects according to different interpretations. They realized the same goal, but they got there in radically different ways. In a word, these saints were both supremely prudent. They had the power to concretely realize a vision of the good in the particulars of their lives. Indeed, in the next canto, Dante helps us see that all of these souls in the heaven of the sun should be seen under the banner of wisdom and prudence. In Canto 13, Aquinas praises Solomon for his choice of, quote, kingly prudence. And Solomon, of course, is held by tradition to be the author of those biblical encomia of wisdom. You'll remember that in Proverbs, for example, Solomon urgently pleads with youth, addressing them as his son, to seek wisdom, to thirst for it, to long for it, to want it more than wealth or beauty or fame. Quote, "My son, if thou wilt receive my words and hide my commandments with thee, so that thou incline thine ear unto wisdom and apply thine heart to understanding, yea, if thou criest after knowledge and liftest up thy voice for understanding, if thou seekest her as silver and searchest for her as for hid treasures, then shalt thou understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord giveth wisdom. Out of his mouth cometh knowledge and understanding." 2 millennia later, Thomas Aquinas offered similar praise of wisdom. At the beginning of his Summa Contra Gentiles, he too poured out his heartfelt praise of wisdom. In the introductory part of that work, he, echoing the words of Solomon, just as Dante has him do here in the heaven of the sun, had said, quote, "Among all human pursuits, the pursuit of wisdom, sapientia, is more perfect, more noble, more useful, and more full of joy. It's more perfect because, insofar as a man gives himself to the pursuit of wisdom, so far does he even now have some share in true beatitude. It is more noble because through this pursuit, man especially approaches to a likeness to God. And since likeness is the cause of love, the pursuit of wisdom especially joins man to God in friendship. It is more useful," Aquinas continues, because through wisdom we arrive at the kingdom of immortality." End quote. Wisdom for Aquinas is the ability to understand the hierarchy of truths in this life. It's not just, say, the ability to know how to use a hammer, a saw, and mend tools, but it's the mastery of the whole craft and the ability to understand the relationship between the different parts of the craft to one another. Analogously, wisdom is not just the ability to know many things, but to know the different domains of human life and various truths of the world, how they're related to one another. Wisdom is also closely related to prudence, which you could say is the ability to see a good and then to construct a method or set of principles which will realize it in everyday life. Prudence is the ability to discover and choose the concrete conditions which will lead to the flourishing of a good family, a good environment in a company, a well-structured classroom, or a well-ordered life. In this sense, prudence is opposed both to a mere speculative knowledge and a mere busy efficiency. To have mere speculative knowledge would not be to have prudence, because such a vision would be bereft of the power to become incarnate in your life. But a mere efficiency, which lacks the vision of wisdom, would also fail to be prudence, because it had no ability to see the final goal for the practical process. The efficient man, then, without wisdom, is like the businessman who successfully increases his company's profits on a daily basis, but no longer knows what good the product brings into the world. Josef Pieper, in his book on the cardinal virtues, explains that the fascinating thing about the virtue of prudence is that it can't be taught as a set of rules. In fact, if you try to be good merely by following rules, then you become brittle and frail. You don't know what to do with the rest of that time that you're not praying. For this reason, prudence was considered a precious gift, because without it, your desire to be good and the moral principles of goodness you hold will never actually find concrete expression in your daily choices. Thus, for Aquinas, wisdom and prudence are worth laboring for, longing for, being zealous for. In a single word, they call for studium, the zealous and attentive pursuit in study. So how can you get such prudence? Aquinas says that there are two essential activities needed to attain it. One, cultivating the memory, and two, letting yourself be guided by a hesitant openness, what Aquinas called docilitas, or docility. Aquinas' stress on memory makes sense. Given that the whole point of prudence is to come up with fresh ideas for particular situations, it cannot be some attempt merely to copy out the solutions from some rule book. No, for Thomas Aquinas, the prudent man is more like an artist, applying to his particular situation the fundamental shapes and colors of the moral world. And yet to do so, it helps to have the mind well stocked with many historical and literary examples of individuals who either abused their opportunities to do real good or heroically and creatively did so. Secondly, Aquinas says that we need to develop a docilitas, what I have translated as hesitant openness. It seems to me that there's no better way to illustrate such docilitas than to quote from a farmer poet from Kentucky, whom many of you will know, Wendell Berry. To illustrate what I think this quality is, in a beautiful and short little essay called Damage, Berry writes about a mistake he made in trying to reshape the landscape of his farm. He writes, "I have a steep wooded hillside that I wanted to be able to pasture occasionally, but it had no permanent water supply. About halfway to the top of the slope, there's a narrow bench on which I thought I could make a small pond. I hired a man with a bulldozer to dig one. He cleared away the trees and then formed the pond, cutting into the hill on the upper side, piling the loosened dirt in a curving earthwork on the lower. The pond appeared to be a success. Before the bulldozer quit work, water had already begun to seep in. Soon there was enough to support a few head of stock. To heal the exposed ground, I fertilized it and sowed it with grass and clover. We had an extremely wet fall and winter, with the usual freezing and thawing. The ground grew heavy with water and soft. The earthwork slumped. A large slice of the wood's floor on the upper side slipped down into the pond. The trouble was the familiar one. Too much power, too little knowledge. The fault was mine. I was careful to get expert advice, But this only exemplifies what I already knew. No expert knows everything about every place, not even anything about any place. If one's knowledge of one's whereabouts is insufficient, if one's judgment is unsound, then expert advice is of little use. Barrie feels a sadness about the failure of his project, in part because of his philosophy of farming. As he says, "In general, I have used my farm carefully. It could be said, I think, that I have improved it more than I have damaged it. My aim has been to go against its history and to repair the damage of other people. But now, a part of its damage is my own." The pond was a modest piece of work, he continues, and so the damage is not extensive. In the course of time and nature, it will heal. And yet there is damage to my place and to me. I have carried out before my own eyes and against my intention a part of the modern tragedy. I have made a lasting flaw in the face of the earth for no lasting good. Until that wound in the hillside, my place, is healed, there will be something impaired in my mind. My peace is damaged. I will not be able to forget it. To our surprise, Barrie says he will not try to cover up the mistake. And in fact, his choice to write about it is part of his decision to bear the wound, to make everyone see the scar he inflicted on his own land he loved so much. Barrie then points out that art serves memory, and it serves it by preserving the freshness of the presence of the wound. Barrie says that it would be irresponsible to try to escape from the damage he has done. Quote, "To lose the scar of knowledge is to renew the wound," he says. In fact, the good artist keeps a record of such scars. He stores them up in his memory, or as Barrie puts it, an art that heals and protects. Its subject is a geography of scars. Barrie's description of the importance of memory, informed by a cautiousness in moving forward, a hesitant openness, I think gets at well the old medieval virtue of prudence, and it helps us feel the timeliness of it as well. So much then for the heaven of the sun. But when you begin to zoom out from these canti, you recognize that what Dante begins in Canto 10, weaving souls together, is in fact an overarching interest throughout all these canti. That is, Dante's fascinated by the idea of the diversity and unity of heaven. We see already in the introduction to Canto 10. There Dante describes the intricacy of the order of the universe, as if the cosmos constitutes God's poem. We now know that if anything within our solar system were even slightly out of balance, then the fecundity of the earth would be ruined. If the earth were any closer to the sun, we would be burned up. If the globe wasn't on a slightly tilted axis, we wouldn't have the variety of seasons, and so forth. From the non-believer's perspective, human life, and even life in general, really shouldn't be. It's an inexplicable miracle. But even in the early 1300s, Dante shared an insight into the irreducible complexity of the universe. If one part were missing, or if one part were slightly damaged, then the clock couldn't function. Here's how Dante puts it at the beginning of his entry into the heaven of the sun. Quote, "See how from the oblique circle that bears the planets on its branches off, to satisfy the world that calls for them. And if their pathway were not thus deflected, many powers in the heavens would be vain, and quite dead almost every potency on earth. And if it slanted farther or less far in the upper or the lower hemisphere, much would be lacking in the order of the world." Seen apart from the whole, the world looks like a series of mistakes, a series of seemingly erratic accidents and off-axis slants. But taken all together, they cooperate to make manifest the secret, deep, and hidden plan of the divine mind. For Dante, the world is almost like a number of musicians who, each waking up in his own house, starts playing a song on his own instrument. But as they all walk into the public square, to their surprise, they discover that their tunes have been mysteriously orchestrated into a symphony. And all of this comes about, of course, because of the divine conductor, if you will, whom Dante prefers to describe in terms of love. Quote, "With me, then, reader, raise your eyes up to the lofty wheels, and from that point begin to gaze in rapture at the master's art. He so loves it in himself that never does his eye depart from it." End quote. Dante is convinced that, quote, He who studies the order of the cosmos cannot but taste of him." End quote. But as we've said before, Dante's cosmos always reflects spiritual processes. As we've said, Dante envisions the physical cosmos as a delicate balance of various parts brought into harmony. And this finds its parallel in how God mysteriously works through and within time, providentially fitting erratic bits and pieces of human beings into a great mosaic of history. When speaking to the eagle in the heaven of Jupiter, Dante's shocked to learn that among the great kings within that heaven, there's not only the great King David, but also Ripheus and Trajan. The latter, Trajan, was a pagan Roman emperor who, according to medieval legend, was prayed out of hell by Gregory. Trajan was allowed to have his flesh back for a day, and he used his time well, repenting and thus being allowed to enter into heaven. But Ripheus is a character in the Aeneid, mentioned in but one line in the Aeneid in passing, as just some soldier who came to help Aeneas fight in Troy. And that's it, left out of the remainder of the Aeneid and forgotten by history, until Dante, who lifts this failed character out of Virgil's audition and makes him literally one of the stars of this heaven. Dante has his eagle ask, quote, "Who in the erring world would think that Trojan Ripheus should be the fifth among the holy lights along this arc?" Dante's shocked. "What are these things I see?" The eagle responds that Ripheus, quote, "through grace, which so wells up, from a source so deep there never was a creature who could thrust his vision to its primal spring. And for that reason, from grace to grace, God opened Ripheus's eyes to our redemption yet to come, so that he believed, and from that time on endured no longer paganism's stench, but rebuked the wayward peoples for it. The three ladies you saw near the right-hand wheel served to baptize him 1,000 years and more before the sacrament existed." End quote. In other words, Dante makes up a backstory, that Ripheus had grown discontent with the answers of his secular paganism and had believed in his heart that there must be something more, and then trusted that God, whoever he was, would reveal a Savior. And so in this way, 1,000 years before Christ, Ripheus, according to Dante's invention, was saved through implicit faith, like Cato. Dante does this to illustrate concretely the mysterious way providence works through history. Trying to understand it in its depth is like expecting to see down to the ocean's floor. And thus, as Canto 10 to 20 of Paradiso progress, we find increasingly more potent images for how this plurality is tightly bound up in a unity. In the heaven of Mars, Dante sees a cross which is glistening with souls which run along the arms and then up and down the upright beam. It's a single thing made up of thousands of individuals. Later in the heaven of Jupiter, Dante of course sees an eagle, but one composed seemingly of thousands of parts. It's a miracle, Dante says, to find such unity. Quote, "And what I must now tell, no voice has ever uttered, nor ink ever wrote, nor was it ever seen in fantasy. For I saw and hear, it was the beak that spoke, sounding with its voice the words I and my, when in conception it meant we and our." In conclusion, in all these canti, we see that Dante is keen to promote the desire for wisdom. But at the same time, he also provides us a vision of heaven which startles, overwhelms, and breaks the small boxes and categories we would like to fit it into. On the one hand, he gives us a vision of a shocking and radical diversity, in which unexpectedly, seemingly random souls are gathered up from foreign lands. Heaven is for Dante as for John in the Apocalypse, quote, "a great multitude, which no man could number, of all nations and kindreds and people and tongues," end quote. Thus, from a certain perspective, you could say that Dante's heaven is more like Los Angeles than Lincoln, Nebraska. No offense, of course, to you loyal Nebraskans who've made it this far. But at the same time, it's also true that most of the time we use that term diversity in contemporary society, what we really end up meaning is radical and isolated pluralism, in which we don't even really have the goods of diversity, because none of those goods are brought together in a meaningful and beautiful whole. Dante has something to say to this as well. While it is true that his heaven has an uncompromising diversity and plurality, it's also true that all of these souls live and breathe as one.